Norrin sighed as he reread his mission briefing, hoping he had either misread it or that by some miracle it had changed. He had not misread anything, and nothing had changed. He was to head out into the woods, link up with 2 members of the Terran Federal Military, and lead them to a hill with a clear view of a Koraf synapse point. From there, the humans would eliminate the relay drone to cut the local drones off from the hive mind, in preparation for a counter-offensive. He had put the datapad down and continued preparing his gear. The task ahead seemed almost impossible. Not only did he need to evade countless Koraf patrols, but he also had to help the humans do the same. None of them had experience navigating this terrain. Moreover, the humid atmosphere of the planet significantly reduced the effective range of laser weapons, so Norrin had no idea how they intended to take down a relay drone from such a long distance. With so many obstacles in their path, he couldn't help but feel like this was a suicide mission. But it was his mission, and he had a duty to carry it out, even if he wasn't happy about it. His personal feelings would have to be set aside. This was about the bigger picture. He checked his gear one last time before heading out, marking the rendezvous point on the display in his helmet. Norrin departed the base, passing through the outer gates where patrols maintained their watch. As he stepped into the wilderness beyond, the structured hum of the base faded, replaced by the quiet rustle of the forest. He moved carefully into the dense undergrowth, his stealth suit helping him meld almost seamlessly with his surroundings. About halfway to the rendezvous point, Norrin spotted a Koraf patrol advancing through the dense foliage. Even the most basic Koraf drones were formidable, and a single misstep could spell disaster. If even one drone detected him, the relay drone would be alerted in moments, and the central hive mind would follow. He dropped low, blending into the natural cover of the forest. His muscles tensed as the patrol passed mere meters from his position. He waited, breath held, until the last drone moved out of sight. Only then did he exhale slowly, resuming his advance with heightened caution. The forest seemed to shift around him, the wind stirring the trees and bushes in an almost rhythmic motion. Norrin ignored the deceptive tranquility. Every step carried the weight of potential danger, but his training and instincts guided him steadily forward. As he neared the rendezvous point, he froze. Another Koraf patrol was heading directly for it. Instinctively, he concealed himself again, scanning the area and weighing his options. With the humans seemingly delayed, and the patrol too close to risk diverting it, waiting was his only viable choice. What caught his attention, however, was a pair of strange markers on his helmet display. 2 patches of underbrush around the rendezvous were highlighted as friendly. It didn't make sense, but there was no time to dwell on it. He waited for what felt like an eternity as the patrol passed by, the Koraf almost stepping directly on top of the supposedly friendly underbrush. When their presence faded, Norrin rose and slowly approached the rendezvous point. To his surprise, as he stepped into the area, the underbrush shifted and stood up, revealing 2 camouflaged figures who had now risen into a crouched stance. One made a hand signal to the other, who quietly moved in the direction of the Koraf patrol. The first figure approached Norrin, and his helmet display updated the marker to identify the figure as Sergeant Evan Hawk Daniels. Evan crouched. The human was nearly invisible against the surrounding environment, his entire form melded into the foliage around him. The fabric of the suit was a patchwork of cool blues and purples, designed to mimic the surrounding plants and shadows. Thin, flexible branches and leaves were woven into the fabric, swaying lightly with the breeze, making the figure appear as nothing more than a natural part of the forest. Norrin noticed the faintest shift in texture, where the suit had been meticulously crafted to imitate not only the plant life, but also the uneven, damp surface of the forest floor. The suit seemed to make its wearer one with the planet itself. Norrin barely even noticed it when the other figure, Corporal Isabel Lizzie Rojas, returned. "They're gone," she said quietly. "That was a close one." Daniels nodded before looking at Norrin. "I'm guessing you're our tour guide?" he asked in a hushed tone. That's right. Kalor Norrin Vaithar. Norrin shook his head slightly, dismissing his shock at what he had seen and focusing on the situation at hand. Our destination is quite some distance from here. Assuming we don't run into too many patrols, we should get there in about 4 or 5 of your hours. So if you two are ready, we should get moving sooner rather than later. Daniels glanced towards Rojas before nodding. Let's get going then. The dense undergrowth made quiet movement difficult, but it also provided excellent cover. Norrin led the way, moving with practiced caution, his keen senses alert to any change in the environment. Behind him, the humans moved carefully, their ghillie suits blending so seamlessly with the environment that Norrin sometimes had to double-check they were still following him. Norrin noticed a soft crunch a short distance ahead of them, and he signaled for the group to stop as he dropped low. Instinctively, Daniels and Rojas mirrored his movement, their forms blending perfectly into the foliage. Norrin pressed himself flat against the ground, his senses straining to catch any sign of what had caused the sound. Faint rustling reached his senses, leaves shifting unnaturally, stems bending, as something moved somewhat carelessly through the forest. Korath. He motioned silently to the humans to hold position, his focus narrowing to the approaching threat. Moments later, 2 Korath patrol members emerged between the towering trunks ahead. Their segmented, glistening bodies moved smoothly, their natural heads sweeping from side to side in a perfect rhythm. Their limbs were sharp and insectile, designed for both combat and utility, and their muted colors blended almost as well with the forest as Norrin himself. The patrol advanced with a deliberate, eerie patience, their bodies making faint scraping noises as they pushed through the dense undergrowth. One paused, tilting his head slightly as if listening, and for a moment Norrin thought it might have noticed something. He forced himself to remain perfectly still, every motionless fibre of his being blending with the terrain. The Korath resumed its march, and the patrol moved closer. Their legs brushed through the ferns and vines. They got so close, Norrin could see minute details in their chitinous armor. One of the patrol members briefly stopped again, its heads turned in the direction of Daniels and Rojas. The humans remained unnervingly silent, as though they had vanished entirely into the foliage. The patrol lingered for another breathless moment, before continuing its methodical sweep of the area. As the patrol slowly moved away from them, eventually the sounds of their movement began to fade. Norrin risked a glance at the others, confirming they were still in position. He waited until the faint rustling disappeared entirely, before signaling for the group to move again. No words were spoken as they resumed their trek, the forest closing in around them once more. As they continued their journey, patrols slowly became bigger and more frequent the closer they got to the synapse point. Each encounter forced them to slow down further, sometimes remaining in place for agonizing stretches of time, as groups of Korath passed nearby. Norrin felt the weight of tension in every step, the stakes rising with each passing moment. Eventually, they reached the hill. While it offered a clear line of sight on the synapse point, the foliage wasn't nearly as dense here. Walking straight up would expose them. Norrin crouched low, scanning the terrain as he pondered how to get the humans up the hill unseen. A light tap on his back startled him, and he turned to see Daniels. "Now it's our turn to do our job, I guess," Daniels whispered. He signaled to Rojas before they both quietly dropped prone. Without a word, the two began slowly crawling up the hill. Norrin watched them for a moment, barely able to track their progress with how slowly and carefully they moved. Their camouflage made them nearly invisible against the uneven ground and scattered vegetation. After a few minutes of observation, Norrin decided to follow their lead. He dropped prone, moving cautiously, but the humans had already disappeared into the terrain ahead of him. It seemed to take another hour before he finally caught up to them. Daniels and Rojas were lying still in a concealed position near the hill's crest, the synapse point visible in the distance. "Nice of you to join us," Rojas whispered with a faint smirk. Nolan didn't reply, instead watching as Daniel silently began to set up his weapon. Daniels moved with deliberate precision, every motion controlled to avoid unnecessary noise or movement. He extended the rifle's bipod, positioning it firmly but gently on a flat patch of earth. The sniper rifle itself was a sleek, matte black weapon with modular components and a barrel nearly as long as Noran's arm. Daniels adjusted the scope, making minuscule turns to the dials, while glancing briefly through the lens. His body remained completely still except for his hands, which worked with the methodical expertise of someone who had done this countless times before. Beside him, Rojas was scanning the synapse point through her binoculars, her voice barely audible as she relayed information to Daniels. Target identified. Synapse relay drone. Elevation approximately -15 degrees relative to our position. Distance 2,755 meters. She paused, taking another moment to observe. Wind speed steady at 8 kilometers per hour, slight crosswind from left to right. Daniels gave a slight nod, making minute adjustments to the rifle's position and angle. Rojas continued gathering details, adjusting her own equipment to monitor environmental factors. Several minor obstructions. Visibility is limited, but we have a direct line to the target, she finished. Noran's eyes flickered to Daniel's rifle, then back to the synapse point. As he watched the humans prepare, a thought struck him. It had been gnawing at him since the mission began. The impossible distance, the humid atmosphere that warped energy-based weapons. But now, seeing the humans' ballistic rifle and their methodical setup, it clicked into place. Of course, the projectile didn't rely on light or energy to reach his target. It would cut through the air, unaffected by the distortions that plagued his people's weaponry in this environment. For the first time, the shot seemed feasible. Still daunting, yes, but not as absurdly out of reach as he had initially feared. The humans had come prepared for the conditions, and their expertise now felt like the critical piece of the puzzle. Noran quietly grabbed his own optics and looked at the base of Synapse Point, where the Synapse relay drone sat beneath a series of high, arching structures, metallic but organic in design, like skeletal ribs growing from the earth to protect it. The relay drone itself was stationed on the ground, nestled between layers of dense foliage and heavy protective barriers made of thick, reinforced material. The drone's dark, iridescent exoskeleton shimmered faintly in the dim light, and its numerous antennae flickered with a quiet, almost imperceptible hum, relaying commands to the surrounding Korath drones. Unlike other drones that could be protected behind thick, chitinous plates, the relay drone needed an open connection with the rest of the hive, but this exposure was highly controlled. It was placed at the center of a large, fortified area, surrounded by heavily armed Korath drones and several smaller camouflage guard posts. The area was heavily monitored, both by drones and automated sentries, keeping the relay drone as safe as possible without obstructing its connection to the hive mind. The positioning was deliberate. The drone needed access to the full spectrum of the Korath hive's communications network, but it also needed protection from potential attack. The result was a carefully balanced vulnerability. A vulnerability they were now in a position to exploit. Daniels took one last look through the scope, making sure everything was in place. His breathing slowed as he made the final adjustments, his movements so smooth they were nearly imperceptible. Rojas glanced at him once more. Fire when ready. Steady, Daniels muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper, as he lined up the crosshairs on the dark, distant silhouette of the relay drone, its antenna twitching in the low light. His finger hovered just above the trigger. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. Noran couldn't help but watch as Daniel's body tensed, then relaxed, his finger gently pulling back. The silence was shattered with the sudden crack of the rifle's report. Daniels had made his adjustments, correcting for the wind, the bullet drop over the 2,755-meter distance, and so much more. Every single factor had been accounted for. The rifle's scope had been carefully set to compensate for the trajectory shift, with Daniels factoring in the exact distance and elevation needed to keep the round true. The bullet struck the relay drone right in its unarmored head. The round tore through the fragile shell, blowing out the back and painting the ground beneath with a gruesome spray of neurons, fluid and dark green ichor. The relay drone immediately went limp, crumpling to the ground. The effect on the Korath drones was immediate. Their synchronized movements faltered, their connection to the hive mind severed. Precision gave way to chaos as a wave of confusion rippled through their ranks. Drones that had been deadly moments before now staggered, some freezing in place, others continuing their last received instructions with mechanical repetition. A few wandered aimlessly, bumping into trees or circling in confusion. Disconnected from the hive's constant directives, they were disorganized and vulnerable, no longer the formidable unified threat they had been. Norrin observed the disarray with grim satisfaction. If their intel was correct, the loss of this relay drone had severed the hive mind's control over this entire front, leaving the central command nodes exposed. The hive mind would respond, of course. Other relay drones would soon relay new orders to cover the gap, but those drones would be stretched thin. Until a new relay drone could be grown and deployed, the Korath's positions on this planet were significantly weakened. "Nice shot, Hawk," Rojas chuckled quietly, her voice tense despite the victory. She had risen into a crouched stance, scanning the area around them for any movement, automatic rifle at the ready. "Thanks, Lizzie," Daniels responded, quickly disassembling his rifle and slinging the case over his shoulder. "Everyone ready to go?" The initial shock caused by the loss of the relay drone wouldn't last forever. The drones would continue their aimless actions, so things were bound to get chaotic. They quickly made their way back into the denser parts of the forest and began the long trek to their extraction point. The trek back was tense, the urgency hanging in the air like a cloud. Norrin led the way, navigating the terrain with silent precision. Behind him, Daniels and Rojas moved in perfect coordination, their steps measured to avoid any unnecessary noise. It wasn't long before they encountered their first patrol. A small group of Korath drones stumbled into view. They moved sluggishly, their once coordinated patterns completely broken. Some were still carrying out old orders, while others wandered aimlessly. The stark contrast between their previous efficiency and their current disarray was almost unsettling. Nora motioned for the others to halt, dropping low into the underbrush. His heart raced, but his body remained still, every sense heightened as he observed the drones. They were no longer a cohesive force. Without the hive mind, they were fragmented, but this made them unpredictable. Rojas crouched beside him, her rifle at the ready. Daniels had already positioned himself as well, automatic rifle aimed at one of the drones. "Easy targets," Rojas murmured, her voice barely audible. Norrin raised a hand, signaling for them to hold. It was safer to let them pass. This group was too big to take out before they could fire back. A few seconds later, the patrol wandered off. Norrin exhaled silently, giving the signal to continue. "Let's go." They moved on, keeping low and silent. Their pace quickened as they navigated the dense foliage. Another patrol appeared shortly after, this one smaller, only 2 drones. These drones were slightly more alert, but still lacked coordination. They wandered in the opposite direction, oblivious to the team's presence. "This one's on us," Daniels whispered, glancing at Rojas, who subtly nodded back at him. He raised his rifle, lined up the shot, and fired. The first drone crumpled, its head snapping back from the precise impact. The second drone paused, momentarily confused, but before it could react, Rojas silenced it with a short burst. The already suppressed sounds of the automatic rifles quickly faded into nothingness as they were absorbed by the dense foliage. "Clear," Rojas muttered. The team continued, slowly picking up the pace. They encountered more scattered patrols along the way. Some they evaded, waiting silently as the confused drones passed by. Others they eliminated quickly and efficiently, when evasion wasn't an option. Norrin's mind remained focused as their distance from the extraction point gradually decreased. He couldn't allow himself to get careless. The final patrol they encountered was barely functional, their disarray almost more comical than threatening. A quick burst from Rogis's rifle entered them swiftly. "We're almost there," Norrin said softly, adjusting his gear as they picked up the pace. The remaining stretch of forest was eerily quiet. It wasn't long before they could hear the quiet hum of a light gunship in the distance. Norrin glanced at his human companions, his thoughts reflecting on the mission. Their seamless coordination, their uncanny ability to blend into the environment, and the incredible precision of that long shot, all of it impressed him deeply. Their skill and efficiency were undeniable, and for a moment, Norrin felt a profound sense of relief and gratitude. He was glad to be on the same side as them. They reached the gunship and climbed aboard, the hum of the engines rising as they lifted off. The craft first flew to the Vimal base, where Norrin disembarked. He watched as the gunship ascended once more, carrying Daniels and Rojas back to what he assumed would be their own base. Norrin turned and headed toward the command center. The Vimal base was alive with activity, its soldiers and support staff now moving with purpose rather than tension. His mission had been the first move in a planet-wide counter-offensive, and the air buzzed with urgency. Teams were assembling for rapid deployment, transports were being loaded, and communication officers relayed updates to the front lines. The command center was the heart of this controlled chaos. Large screens displayed shifting battle maps, while command staff went methodically to monitor and assess the rapidly changing situation. Norrin approached the outer briefing room, where debriefings were typically held, away from the most sensitive discussions. As he entered, his superior was already waiting. Norrin straightened, ready to deliver his full report. A fleeting thought crossed his mind. If the Terran Federal Military continued to provide support like this offensive might actually see some measure of success.